Okay.
Pressing the button, and we are going live. We are now live.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Walter. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this lecture of today, which is really the lecture of last Tuesday. Excuse us for this, let's say, connectivity problems and software issues we had, so that we had to postpone the lecture. This is really the first time it happened. It's astonishing how well technology worked in these 2 years where we had our online lectures. So it's really the first time, but up to now it worked well. And I hope it will work today, as we see. I'm happy to have again with us Benjamin Gregg. He is a political scientist at the University of Texas in Austin. I'm glad to have you with us, Benjamin, and you will talk about AI and politics and impact on politics. The moderation will be done by Stefan Woltran today, who will then also introduce Benjamin in more detail. Just for a short reminder to our organizational things, we have 30 minutes talk by Benjamin, and then we have a 30 minutes Q&A moderated by Stefan. And then afterwards, we have a piece of music. We end up, as always, with the piece of music. This time it's proposed by Benjamin Gregg. Thanks for proposing. And today the operations as well as the music is done by Walter Palmetzhofer. I thank you very much for that, Walter. Since Peter Knees is not available today, he is on a workshop out of Vienna. I'm happy to introduce Stefan Woltran, the moderator. Stefan is coming from TU Wien. Let's say he's really a hardcore computer science guy. He is a professor of formal foundations of AI, so he's really coming from the logics part of our faculty. He heads the research unit, the research group on databases and artificial intelligence. He also is a recipient of the Staat Award of the Austrian Science Fund, which is a really prestigious award. With quite a donation, a financial donation. He's a fellow of the European Association for AI, and he is the co-founder and the co-director of the newly founded Center for AI and Machine Learning here at TU Wien, which started, I think, now 7 months ago. Stefan, thanks for doing the moderating, and danke. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hannes, for this kind introduction. A very warm welcome also from my side to all of you. It is a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. So Benjamin Gregg teaches social and political theory as well as bioethics with connection to philosophy and sociology. And he does this at the University of Texas at Austin, but also in Germany, Austria, Sweden, Japan, China, and Brazil. He studied in Princeton, Berlin, and at Yale. He is author of several books, the more recent ones being Human Rights as Social Construction, 2012, The Human Rights State from 2016, and there will be a new book published soon by Cambridge University Press, Constructing Human Nature, the Political Challenges of Genetic Engineering. Currently, he is Fulbright Distinguished Chair in Public International Law at Lund University in Sweden. So we are, of course, very happy to have a person today with us who will talk about AI, but not being an AI expert. And I think this is important, no? Since this discourse we have on digital humanism, also on AI aspects of digital humanism, should include several disciplines and the general public, being a matter that affects us all. And when I talked to Benjamin before this event, so he promised that in his talk he will speculate about the future. So we are very curious about this, Benjamin, and I ask you to share your screen.
Okay.
And yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I thank the Vienna Initiative for Digital Humanism, as well as its director, Hannes Wertner, for the opportunity to present my work to you today, and I thank Stefan Voltran for moderating. I must say I'm sorry that I had to be the example of the problem with connectivity after so many successes, but maybe in Vienna you would say at least it distinguishes me from others. No, stop share. Yeah. Oh, maybe I spoke too early. Why is it not changing?
We can see the slides.
Yeah, I know oh, okay. I don't know why there was a pause. Okay. Here's my argument. For a variety of reasons, political communities in the future may be tempted to outsource to AI some of the tasks and responsibilities of politics. They may be tempted because algorithmic approaches can manipulate data better than can human intelligence. Better in collection, classification, in aggregation, in analysis. Algorithmic approaches can solve complex problems currently beyond human intelligence. More importantly, they promise to reduce some of the overwhelming complexity that make aspects of modern political life so difficult for us and so vulnerable to bad choices. I still have problems. The slide is not changing. You are sharing screen.
Maybe you have to switch to the window where you have the slide. Maybe you are in the Zoom window, not in the viewer.
Ah, here. That will help. Let me see. There we go. Okay. All right. But if they do, political communities may undermine themselves as democratic associations. Democratic politics requires the peculiarly political capacity of human intelligence. Tasks and responsibilities of politics outsourced to AI could not be democratic. Since at least Mary Shelley's 1818 novel, Frankenstein, if not since the ancient Greek myth of Icarus, we humans have worried about harming ourselves with our technologies. So while the claim that we humans can harm ourselves with our own technologies is age-old, what is new, I contend, is how I ground my claim by arguing two things. First, that democratic politics requires an attitude on the part of participants of mutual responsibility taking. And second, that responsibility taking is a capacity of human intelligence, but not a capacity of AI. For all of our progress in understanding ourselves natural scientifically, intelligence still remains a mystery in many ways. Not surprisingly, there is no agreed upon definition of intelligence. One of the things we do know, however, is that what happens in the mind is related in various ways to aspects of the brain's environments. Certain neurophysiological changes occur in a person's brain as she engages with her environments. The brain's relationship with its environments is a relationship of mutual influence. My goal is to show how that relationship can sometimes have a distinctly political dimension. The brain has many environments. The most immediate and permanent one is, of course, the body of the brain bearer. Now, social relationships constitute another kind of environment. Some features of human intelligence derive from such relationships. For example, as people go about their daily lives and interact with others, they mutually construct a social environment. They do so on the basis of affective and social responses that involve features of intelligence. Some of the features of intelligence that mark social relationships include the following: each participant's conception of self, multiple participants' recognition of each other's selfhood, participants taking seriously their own social and affective responses, and taking seriously the social and affective responses of other participants. What we are currently doing and thinking is molded in part by whomever we are interacting with. Just as we are embedded in the physical world, so we are also embedded in the mental world of others. Human intelligence is a product of the deep history of undirected natural evolution. It develops from a mix of biology, natural environments, as well as social and cultural environments. Some scientists speak of a creative explosion about 50,000 years ago, when people who had looked like us since 200,000 years ago now began acting like us. By contrast, AI emerged very, very recently. The term artificial intelligence was coined only in 1956. Like many technologies, AI emerges from a process that is highly directed and highly reflected. And yet, we are always tempted to analogize AI to human intelligence. Maybe we are so tempted because both involve the manipulation of information toward generating new insights that can enhance the effort to negotiate aspects of reality and all of its complexity. Still, many factors speak against analogies. Consider three. First, as the individual is socialized in a process that lasts her entire life, she internalizes some of the behavioral norms of her cultural environments. But internalizing social norms is very different from uploading or downloading a computer file. Human intelligence has a capacity to analyze, accept or reject, or modify the internalized norms. Unlike that computer and its files, human intelligence is self-conscious and self-reflexive. Humans can contravene the ethical systems and legal rules to which they have pledged themselves. In some cases, doing so is a form of wrongdoing, misconduct, criminality. But in other cases, it's a form of moral agency, justified resistance, defiance of oppression. By contrast, AI is unlikely or unable to spontaneously override its own programming. Further, not only can human intelligence analyze the rules that an individual or a community has given itself, it can also respond to that analysis from a specifically moral standpoint, or it can respond from a political conviction. And it might respond by breaking the rule. And it might break the rule because doing so is ethically warranted. Consider, for example, acts of civil disobedience. In 1930, Gandhi's Salt March to protest British colonial laws that discriminated against Indians. In 1956, Rosa Parks' bus boycott in Alabama to protest racial discrimination in the American South. In 1989, student demonstrations in China's Tiananmen Square to protest unfair advantages through connections and influence enjoyed by family members of Communist Party members and other elites in a supposedly classless society. Second, human intelligence is embodied. A whole range of different body states results from the subtle play of chemical and electrical signals that take place in our brain body. We experience these various body states as drives, appetites, motivations, predispositions, emotions, moods, phobias. And these neural configurations interact with the things we see and hear and feel. Third, humans have emotions. Emotions are a phenomenon of our biology, and they play a significant part in our behavior. For example, anger provokes aggressive behavior. Disgust motivates avoidance behavior. Happiness encourages repetition of the pleasing behavior. And we all know how powerful emotions can be in the political sphere. Citizens' passion for a particular issue or candidate may motivate their participation in the public sphere, or their anger and disgust at the political status quo may motivate the choices they make at the polls. The possession of human intelligence seems always to be accompanied by interaction. One interacts with oneself, introspection, for example. One interacts with other persons. One interacts with environments, both natural and social. Interaction in these cases refers to conscious behavior, often self-conscious behavior. In that behavior, consciousness, body, and its environments are co-constitutive. For example, at any given time, we have a sense of where we are in space, in time, but also in cultural identity. This sense is shaped dynamically by our interaction with our different environments, and it is shaped along multiple sensory dimensions. Shaping our senses through interaction with the environment means that consciousness is something we actively achieve rather than something that passively happens inside of us. It also means that human intelligence does not begin or end with the brain. Like our skin, our brain is not some kind of critical boundary between what we are as individual human beings and our physical, social, and political environments. On the contrary, we humans are what we do. We are where we are, and we are how we interact with our environments. For example, we can interact through tools, through language, through collective practices. I see two upshots here. First, in interacting with our social and political environments, we constitute ourselves also as political beings. A second upshot, human intelligence is not independent of the particular social and cultural context in which it manifests itself. By contrast, AI, today at least, does not constitute itself in its relationship with the data it processes. Its operation does not depend on particular social and cultural contexts, as far as I know. And AI does not constitute itself in its relation to human beings, at least not in the way that humans mutually constitute each other. For humans, AI, at least as we know it today, can only be an object. It cannot be a subject, at least not yet. The relationship between human intelligence and AI cannot be intersubjective. AI is not capable of intersubjectivity, at least not today. Further, human self-consciousness is a kind of self-identity. It is that feature of our experience by virtue of which our experiences are ours. For our minds, experiences have a kind of mine-ness. It makes them distinctively our own. But Mineness can only exist in a context of otherness. That is, to be a human self is to be aware of and engaged with other human selves. The human self grasps itself vis-a-vis other selves. By contrast, one piece or instance of AI does not grasp itself vis-a-vis another piece of AI, and one piece of AI does not grasp itself vis-a-vis humans. Consciousness is co-constitutive of its environments. That is one way of saying that consciousness engages in various forms of exchange with its environments. Consider three forms. One is symbolic exchange. Symbolic exchange between and among different humans, above all through language, points to several additional differences between AI and human intelligence. While both engage in exchange via symbols, only human intelligence has a capacity to engage in the distinctly political manipulation of symbols. By the term political, I mean, here in my talk today, something narrow and specific. I mean the normative contestation of competing moral values, commitments, and visions in the public sphere on the basis of discursive arguments. Only human intelligence is capable of the political act of moral debate, the social achievement of debating competing value commitments. I speak of those values that may influence how people decide to organize political community, as a unitary theocratic republic, for example, or as a monarchy, or as a parliamentary democracy, or as an authoritarian welfare state. Consider the differences between the respective political cultures of, say, EU member states and China. Consider the critiques that could be made of each and the defenses that could be mounted for each. Those arguments are forms of symbolic exchange. The neural networks of human intelligence that somehow make moral and political thought and behavior possible are not symbolic machines. But the digital networks of AI are nothing but symbolic machines. Unlike human intelligence, AI has no moral capacity. Moral exchange is a capacity of human intelligence. It is a capacity for political argument, for intersubjectively co-constructing moral norms and for regulating our common social life by those norms. Yet a third kind of exchange involves distribution. To explain what distribution is, I need to provide some context. The human self is not a genetic constant. It bears the genetic makeup of its forebears, and it shapes itself along an unforeseen path. The world we humans inhabit is not pre-given and then inhabited post facto through some optimal adaptation. The world we humans inhabit is laid down as we walk in it. In other words, the human self is emergent, always in the process of becoming. AI is also emergent, but in a very different sense. Its operation specifies a domain of relevance, which becomes a kind of world or a network in terms of which AI operates. The performance of each of the simple computing elements is distributed over its connections to other network elements. The ongoing activity of units, together with constraints from the system's environments, constantly produces emerging global patterns over the entire network. These patterns constitute its performance. Note another difference. Human intelligence emerges as consciousness. By contrast, AI emerges as something that might be called connectionism. In both cases, emergent patterns give the entire system capacities not available to the components in isolation. For example, capacities for recognition or memory. For human intelligence, the units are individual persons. For AI, bits of information. For human intelligence, the emergent pattern is human integration. For AI, the integration of information. But I see one similarity between the connectionism of AI and the neural networks of human intelligence. Both are based on dynamic distribution. Let me explain. In democratic political community, dynamic distribution is an element in the structure of legitimacy. Power is distributed ideally among citizens whose support for a candidate or policy or referendum may decide the issue, and by deciding democratically, gives legitimacy to the outcome. By contrast, in digital cultures, dynamic distribution has no legitimizing function or no function that is politically legitimizing. Indeed, to replace the dynamic distribution possible in political community with the dynamic distribution of digital cultures would displace political legitimacy achieved through human interaction with some form of AI-directed administration of humans. Here we glimpse one of the potential dangers of some future form of AI. I will identify others. Earlier, I said that we humans are embedded in the mental world of each other. The human brain produces a mental world of our physical and social environments. It constantly checks this model against experience. Our interactions with others is based on the mental model each of us has. In social contexts, we monitor the behavior, reactions, and thinking of others, and we draw conclusions. What we are doing and thinking is molded in part by whomever we are interacting with. One politically relevant cognitive molding is empathy, the psychological identification with the feelings, thoughts, or attitudes of other persons. Empathy occurs when the brain activity of two or more people closely mirrors one another, such that participants share similar feelings. So we humans empathize with each other by creating similar cognitive states. By doing so, we co-constitute a shared state, namely a shared concern with others. That concern could be one element in rational debates about political alternatives. It could be one driver of politics. I want to emphasize another political capacity of human cognition, the peculiarly human capacity for the mutual attribution of responsibility. The development of moral consciousness in the form of empathy for one's fellow human beings, for example, is a social phenomenon. By learning to see in other human beings intentionally acting beings, we make social cooperation possible. To be a member of a liberal democratic community, individuals must be able to attribute responsibility to others for their convictions and for their actions. They need to be able to do so mutually. In this way, the cognitive processing of experience, but also the development of moral consciousness, as well as the capacity for politics of a democratic kind, are based on the complementary entanglement of participants' respective perspectives. Each participant is at once both communicative participant and communicative observer of other participants. By means of intersubjective communication, humans construct a kind of third-person perspective. From this perspective, participants can judge themselves, both as individuals and as observers of other participants. They can judge others. They can verify agreement or disagreement with each other. They can empathize with each other. Just as human beings depend on social interaction throughout their lives, so they depend on the empathy of others. Culture can recognize and valorize empathetic behavior within the community and sometimes beyond it. Individuals can become carriers of social programming for empathy. Empathy in the political sphere is carried by intelligence. The meaning of what happens in digital space comes from the non-digital settings of political community. This is analogous to how the norms that judge online experience can only come from non-digital spheres. For example, the spheres of political, moral, and legal thought. With regard to the right to freedom of expression online, political community is called upon to arbitrate among private interests and public interests. A private interest, for example, might be individual privacy. Online privacy, in the form of anonymity, sometimes leads some people to behave irresponsibly online. Here, that private interest clashes with a public interest in the security and well-being of private individuals, online and offline. Empathy for others is the goal of such arbitration. Empathy is a phenomenon of human intelligence that sometimes may be able to confront some challenges raised by some forms of AI. As a concern for one's fellow members in political community, empathy offers a political deployment of consciousness. Deployment is political in part because it is a deployment of free will. After all, one cannot be forced to be empathetic. One bears empathy toward others, if at all, then only as a matter of free will. In this context, we might answer the question, why do our brains make us experience ourselves as free agents? We might answer that question by saying that we humans get some advantage from experiencing ourselves as free agents. And one such advantage is the capacity for individual and communal self-determination by means of politics. AI cannot substitute for this capacity. As I argued earlier, AI cannot participate in the intersubjective mutual attribution of responsibility necessary for politics in democratic community. So what exactly is the danger I warn against? The danger is that human communities have motivation enough to delegate to AI aspects of political participation and deliberation. Let's see why. AI can neither secure nor guarantee political features of liberal democratic community, but it might well facilitate a degree of social integration along other dimensions of public life in modern societies. For example, algorithms can solve complex problems at the limits of human decision-making capacities. In algorithmic approaches, AI boosts capacities for collecting data, classifying it, structuring it, aggregating and analyzing it toward enhancing insight and prediction. By boosting data management in these ways, AI might contribute positively toward public administration that is better than would otherwise be the case. AI might do so by treating responsibility along the dimension of accountability, where it based accountability for public policy on algorithmic approaches in certain ways. For example, in healthcare, or fair employment, or criminal justice, algorithms may be able to balance accountability, efficiency, and fairness. Algorithms can support greater evidence-based decision-making. They can make statistical predictions and recommendations that are more robust and more accurate than those made by humans. To be sure, algorithms cannot guarantee such outcomes. Further, negative unintended consequences are always possible. For example, the delegation of political, economic, or other tasks and decisions to algorithms increases their capacity to include or exclude particular groups of individuals and information in diverse settings. Further, algorithms may perpetuate or reinforce current patterns of discrimination, and they may create new forms of injustice by reproducing prejudices of prior participants. They may create new forms of injustice by replicating persistent social biases. Note that only humans can evaluate the outcomes of algorithmic processes to identify possible harms created. Only humans can decide who should be held accountable. In other words, only humans can do the politics of liberal democratic community. I've argued that the mutual attribution of responsibility by members of a political community is one basis for demanding accountability. Mutual attribution demands accountability by requiring decision makers to present themselves before persons whose interest they either represent or otherwise affect. Accountability requires decision makers to report and to justify algorithmic decision making. Responsibility taking in this sense is a peculiarly human activity. It is often a political activity. It is not a capacity of AI. The rapidly developing relationship between AI and human intelligence defies any essentialist ontology. Essentialism views artificial intelligence and human intelligence as necessarily and enduringly in opposition to one another, and as entirely distinct one from the other. Against essentialism, I argue that AI does not pose a political danger inherently or necessarily. If there is a political danger, it derives not from AI as such. It derives from how humans deploy it. My argument has been that danger would derive above all from the decision of a community to outsource to AI some of the political and moral tasks of human community. That danger would be preceded by another, the danger that a political community that came to believe that its members no longer needed to be able to attribute responsibility for their actions and the actions of others. Danger would derive from citizens' conviction that by outsourcing this feature to AI, the political community somehow might achieve greater efficiency, greater fairness, and a more rational administration of society. But a society that sought to outsource the tasks of political community to AI would instead undermine core features of democratic community: political deliberation, making decisions in the public sphere, and taking responsibility for those decisions and actions while other participants take responsibility for their decisions and their actions.
Okay, thank you very much, Benjamin, for this very enlightening talk. We now have time for the discussion, so you can raise your hand or use the chat. Let's see whether I will just overlook something. Not yet, so maybe let me start with one question which came up during your talk to me. So, okay, you of course you outlined the danger of AI, but then you also had examples where we can use AI for good. But do you also have, so to say, an idea how we could use AI to improve in the political context, for instance, in the deliberation process or in the political debate? Is there maybe potential?
Clearly there is, in an analytic sense, if we wish to understand empirical data about, for example, the distribution of resources or the distribution of burdens, algorithms might provide greater insight than would otherwise be possible, or understanding maybe correlations between, let's say, incarceration rates and ethnicity, or race, or other factors. The complex manipulation of information can reveal insights, and that is an area that is relevant to politics, where AI could contribute. My argument is, though, that we should draw the line at where it comes to interpreting that data and applying it. Also to be aware. Only humans can be aware of mistakes that AI may be making. You will be familiar with this famous case, I believe, of a woman in the United States, a computer scientist, a Black woman, who was interested in facial recognition, and she discovered that, in fact, the program could recognize faces to a various extent, but it best recognized white males, and then white females, and then Black males, and then least of all, Black females. And this was not intended. It had to do with the provision of images, for example, to build a database. But the program itself was in no position to realize that there was an unintended consequence of social unfairness. And in that sense, again, the advantages of AI in the political sphere must also be balanced against dangers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Alison Stenger raised her hand.
And unmute myself.
So here you are.
Yes, here I am. I exist. Thank you so much for this excellent and thought-provoking talk. I was thinking the entire while about this book that I'm teaching in my class today. It's called The Every. Is anybody familiar? Are you familiar? Have you read this book, The Every? I highly recommend it to everybody. I'll put it in the chat. It's a novel that illustrates, I think, something we need to be afraid of, and I wonder whether you might comment on, is that empathy can be manufactured or measured by AI. And it's demonstrated repeatedly in this novel that, you can make people in this dystopia. The premise of the novel is that Google acquires Amazon, and this enormous monopoly starts encroaching upon all aspects of human existence, essentially taking away our freedom. And they justify it by keeping people safe, right? And by fairness. There's kind of a Chinese argument in there too. But I wonder if you might comment on two things. One, the role of big tech in potentially impeding or advancing sustainable democracy, right? That's one aspect of it. But two, this sort of insidious movement I think we see in parts of the United States where people have become more ideological and polarized and seek a world in which they don't have to choose. They get their choices dictated to them. And I think that's a kind of soft despotism, as Tocqueville might have described, that is very real and potentially relevant. In fact, the subtitle of this book is The Every, at Last a Sense of Order, The Final Days of Free Will, or, and this is my favorite, limitless choice is killing the world. So could you comment on those two aspects, both bigness
Yes.
and our sad
Yes.
human desire for being safe?
Right. Okay. With regard to the role of big tech, that is an obvious danger. We see it already. A famous example is that Facebook and Twitter threw off a certain Donald Trump because of the nature of his tweets. And certainly one understands the unsavory character of those tweets. One understands the political consequences of the systematic disinformation. But at the same time, one wonders about the status of private companies that are making decisions about who is and who is not part of the public sphere. And in fact, one would think in a democracy that private capital should not have that capacity. And it seems to me that we see in this example the enormous power of AI already in the direction of it cannot be left to its own devices. It cannot be left to the market. And that we require regulation because we can see increasingly precisely the political dangers that it poses. And I think these political dangers, by the way, are not necessarily intended. I think in most cases, they're not intended. That's not a defense. That's to say that there's no evil genius behind all of this pulling strings, but rather that the remarkable capacity represented by AI easily goes in directions that are unintended. It needs to be monitored, but we don't want to we don't want to abandon it either. It's like many tools, it's double-edged. You talk about this movement, secondly, in the United States of where people are seeking to isolate themselves and so forth. Here it seems to me
just to be driven by ideology. So they believe things that aren't even true.
Right.
Because it's a ready packaged way to be part of a community.
Right. I mean, I think what it has to do, I think in part with the misery of human existence in various ways. We are frail, vulnerable creatures. We are very needy, and we cope sometimes less, sometimes better. If you go to your local store, you can observe how much alcohol is sold. That's a coping mechanism for many people. Yeah. And so also, as it turns out, social media, for example, and we see the dangers. Again, the unintended consequence of AI can undermine, for example, the political goals of interaction. And one of the reasons that people are vulnerable is because doing politics instead of losing yourself in social media is painful. It can be unproductive. It can be boring. It can take a lot of time. And so in this sense, AI speaks to, we can be seduced because of our own weaknesses. And that's why I fear that the biggest danger of AI is not some kind of AI that eats us, but rather that we humans allow ourselves to be seduced by it because it appears to make life easier. It doesn't, in fact, just like drugs and alcohol don't make life easier, but it gives that impression, and humans are very, very susceptible to that. And clearly AI will only become more important and more powerful in the future. And we struggle mightily. What's very clear from my study of politics is that first, two things. Number one, we humans really, really, really need it. We need to organize our communal life. Second, we are really, really bad at doing politics. And I don't think there is a shortcut. We humans must confront our own weaknesses and neediness and so forth, rather than seeking an escape, a false escape that social media all too readily offers.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So there is a question not in the Zoom chat, but in the YouTube chat by Jeff White, and he asked me to read it. So I will now do this and maybe shorten it a bit. So Jeff says he has a paper on the idea of using AI models to simulate effects of policy changes on institutions and their arrangements, and more directly to construe ideal social, political, economic, institutional arrangements, and to plot a course of transition states from current relatively unjust, unsustainable arrangements to ideally just and sustainable arrangements. And his question then is, have you considered the use of AI in these ways rather than a substitution for human political thought?
I mentioned in my talk, actually, some ways in which AI, in terms of data analysis, can provide very positive information to create a more just community. And I think my response in case to this particular question, though, would be I would be uncomfortable thinking in terms of ideal. We experience, after all, the fact of plurality. That is to say, within communities and across communities, very diverse perspectives and values and commitments. And even though as we strive for agreement, it seems to me that at any given time, we have to be nervous about whatever answers we come up with. And I don't think anybody, not all people will be persuaded by those answers. And the AI could certainly help in simulating effects and providing data that might allow us to see some consequences. But at the end of the day, then it seems to me a peculiarly human task to make the value judgments about which we prefer, which we don't, which has consequences that are bearable and which does not. And what do we do about the people that disagree and have different ideas? And so I am certainly friendly toward the suggestion. I would just say again that we need to be very thoughtful about our deployment of AI.
Thank you. Hannes, please.
Just from
virtual hand.
Thanks, Benjamin or Benjamin. So it's just a remark. What we are already doing that, not in the sense of AI, but using complex simulation software. Look at the environmental disaster we are looking at, and this is based on forecast calculations we have.
Yes.
So we are really showing this is an if-then. What happens if we don't do that, or what happens what we do? And that's also supporting the political decision making. So it's supporting democratic processes. So this is a typical example where we could use it.
Right. But it'd be more difficult if we want to answer the question. So, for example, questions that can be very divisive. Let's say the abortion. How should we understand the moral status of the fetus? How should we compare that status with the moral status of a woman? Who should decide? Those certainly in the United States, among other places, this is something of an intractable question. And I could imagine people thinking, if we could only find some other route to decide it, and we can't. And it may be that for a while we have a question that we just cannot achieve consensus on. Mm-hmm. But the only way forward has to be a political discussion, and the superior data analysis, analytic capacities of AI would play a secondary role. For example, establishing perhaps the social consequences, often devastating, of women forced to carry a fetus to term, or correlations between the socioeconomic status of people who are affected by such a law and those who, because of their social station, the strength of their social positioning, are not really bothered by such regulation. Those questions that are so difficult still must remain political and not be outsourced, it seems to me.
I had a second part. It was just a comment, and I agree on this political question, because there we have a democratic dilemma, which is also in our manifesto. Because in the manifesto we say, at the end, decisions which impact humans and society have to be done by humans or by democratic processes. Okay. On the other side, we also state that there is to be this democratic process as a barrier for this overuse of AI. But what happens if we decide in a democratic process to delegate all those things to AI? This then is this is a democratic dilemma.
It is indeed.
Yeah, and I just want, so it's a deep political question, how we can proceed, where we are convinced that this would be a wrong step. Well, if the majority, this was coming up with the example you had in the US, what happens if we as a majority decide this has to be delegated?
This is the tragedy of politics. Politics works with answers that are socially constructed. They are not true in the sense of social scientific propositions. They are vulnerable to all the biases and other unfortunate characteristics of human life, and people make mistakes, and we will make mistakes in the future. And finally, we humans, our species, should bear the following in mind. Biologists tell us that more than 99% of all evolved organisms on Earth in the last 4.5 billion years have gone extinct naturally, quite aside from those that were driven to extinction by mankind. Now, there is no reason a priori in the world that our species should be any different. We may kill ourselves. We may do so with nuclear weapons, for example. And it's not at all clear. We can't expect politics to save us when we think of politics as something independent of us. Politics is a means by which we do the best we can, and it will always mirror, to some extent, our weaknesses and frailties and so forth. That said, it is the case that there is progress in human history. I like to, when I'm in a classroom beginning a course with my students, I like to point out that the modern Western university is 1,000 years old. I think it began in Bologna. And for more than 950 of those 1,000 years, women were systematically excluded, as we all know. It was never a question. And today, if anybody were to walk into a classroom and it was all male or all female, I think we would say, hey, just a moment, that requires an explanation. Why is that? We have, at least in this part of the world, freely, I think, persuaded ourselves to aspire to a world in which of sexual equality. And that is a form of social progress that we've been able to make despite all of our weaknesses and biases and neediness and so forth. And so even as there's no guarantee, we have to be optimists.
Okay.
This would have been already a very nice final words, but nonetheless, let me ask whether think we have time for one more short question and short answer, if there is some left open. Otherwise, let me just, Alison is raising now her real hand, not only the virtual hand, but the real hand.
No, I don't mean to monopolize, but I'm curious if you would leave us with some suggestions for books you found particularly relevant for understanding these issues in your many years of study. Because I think there's a tendency for us to reinvent the wheel, whereas there are texts that have gone before us that can shed light on some of these issues.
Right.
Sorry, Benjamin, can I shorten this question? Because to operationalize the question of Alison, what we are just doing, Alison, we're doing a reading list.
Yeah.
And I asked Benjamin, instead of now thinking, to think and then write me via email your reading list, and we will put it on our website. We have already compiled nearly 50 books, and we will publish it soon. So there will be a reading list on the issues of different perspectives on digital humanism. And Benjamin, I ask you to send me books related to what you have said, not only your own books, but others, with maybe a short comment, just 5 to 10 lines maximum, so that the guys at our website can say, okay, whether this is worthwhile for them to read. So this is really, I think, the most efficient way to handle this issue. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Hannes, also for mentioning this reading list. There's a question in the chat concerning a link, but if I understood correctly, Hannes, this will be published in the near future on our webpage.
Yeah, we will be next 2 or 3 weeks. We already have compiled, and it's just a formatting, and then we hope then, having published the reading list, that we will add other books, that this will be the starting point for. Okay.
Okay, so I think this brings us to the end of today's lecture. I would like to thank very much Benjamin for his presentation, and also for the audience for questions. And I also just wanted to point that there are some remarks in the chat, and also the pointer to the novel Alison has mentioned. I think it is Walter's choice to announce the piece of music. No, it's Walter's choice to announce the next lecture. It's Walter's task to announce the next lecture. And then, Benjamin, I would ask you to say a few words about the piece of music you have chosen for us today.
Okay. I have chosen a piece. It's a violin solo by a Swiss violinist named Paul Giguère. He is an avant-garde composer, and I chose it because I think you will find it somewhat uplifting, and I think in the face of the discouragements that I spoke of, we need to lift our spirits.
Okay, thank you. So our